What does it take to restart a society from absolute zero? In 1945, Germany faced this very challenge. Currency was worthless. Shelves were empty. The future was a question mark. Germans called it 0 hour, a collapse so complete that normal life had to be rebuilt from scratch. Here's what that aftermath looked like for ordinary German people. The cessation of hostilities in May 1945 did not bring immediate relief. It brought a new reality of navigating a world turned to dust. For the German civilian, the first challenge was simply moving through a transformed and treacherous landscape. Cities like Berlin presented scenes of profound devastation where entire urban blocks had collapsed into mountains of rubble. Streets were often impassable, choked with debris from bombed-out buildings and the detritus of a collapsed military infrastructure. The basic skeleton of a modern city, water mains, electrical grids, sewage systems, was almost entirely non-existent. This destruction extended far beyond the architectural. It was deeply psychological. People emerged from cellars and bunkers into a world where every familiar landmark had been erased, creating a profound sense of dislocation and loss. The physical environment they now inhabited was a constant, visible reminder of the total failure of the Nazi state that had promised a 1,000-year Reich. Navigation through this new terrain was a daily exercise in memory and hazard, as individuals tried to trace paths to water sources or distribution points using only their recollection of where streets and buildings once stood. The sheer volume of material was staggering. Initial estimates suggested that across Germany, 14 billion cubic feet of rubble needed clearing, with Berlin suffering particularly devastating damage from 50,000 tons of explosives dropped during the war. This was not merely a cleanup operation. It was a fundamental precondition for any form of recovery. The most immediate crisis, however, was housing. Millions were homeless, forced to seek shelter in the basements of gutted structures or in any building that retained a partial roof. This rudimentary shelter offered little protection from the elements and even less from the pervasive dust and fear that permeated the air. Every aspect of life was dictated by this broken landscape. A simple journey to find food or potable water became a major undertaking requiring careful planning and physical endurance. The environment itself was a hazard, with unstable piles of masonry and exposed reinforcement bars posing constant threats. The landscape was not passive. It actively shaped the rhythm and possibilities of existence, reducing life to its most elemental concerns of shelter and sustenance. This physical reality, a cityscape of total ruin, set the stage for the immense task of clearing and rebuilding that would consume the next 5 years and define the character of the nascent post-war nation. The scale of the challenge was unprecedented, demanding a collective effort born from sheer necessity. Amid the ruins, the fundamental machinery of survival seized up entirely. With the state apparatus dissolved, the most basic human need became the central preoccupation of every individual. The Allies established an official rationing system, but the designated levels were brutally insufficient. For a normal consumer, the allocation often hovered at or below 1,500 calories per day. This was not an accident of circumstance, but a deliberate component of the Allied industrial plan, a policy designed to prevent any possibility of German rearmament. The humanitarian consequences of this strategy were devastating. The official ration card was largely a theoretical document. The actual distribution of food was chaotic and unreliable. Ration cards categorized the population, with non-working family members receiving the lowest allocation, a level grimly referred to as the hunger or cemetery card. Many people received far less than their official allotment, if they received anything at all. The situation grew particularly dire in the British zone by March 1946, where rations were formally reduced to a near-starvation level of approximately 1,000 calories per day. The physiological effects of this chronic undernourishment were severe and visible. Medical reports documented widespread health crises directly linked to malnutrition. Hunger edema, a swelling caused by severe protein deficiency, became commonplace. The population's susceptibility to infectious diseases like tuberculosis increased dramatically as immune systems faltered. Wound healing slowed to a dangerous crawl, turning minor injuries into potentially life-threatening conditions. This profound hunger dictated the very rhythm of daily existence. Hours each day were consumed by the act of queuing. People stood in long, silent lines outside distribution points, often with no guarantee that any food would remain when they reached the front. This exhausting ritual consumed energy that the body could scarcely afford to spend. Life narrowed to a single, relentless focus: the procurement of calories. This systemic failure gave rise to a vast and essential parallel economy. The black market became not a fringe activity, but a central pillar of survival. Items like cigarettes, coffee, and chocolate, primarily available from Allied soldiers, became a de facto currency, their value far exceeding the worthless Reichsmark. Transactions in this shadow economy were dangerous but necessary for obtaining food, medicine, and fuel. A parallel practice known as hamstering emerged as a desperate response to urban starvation. City dwellers, possessing little more than their remaining personal valuables, would travel to the countryside to barter with farmers. A family heirloom, a piece of jewelry, or fine china might be traded for a sack of potatoes or a few kilos of grain. This foraging consumed immense effort and exposed individuals to significant risk, but it represented one of the few avenues for supplementing the meager official rations. The struggle was intensified by the environment itself. The winter of 1946 brought temperatures that plummeted to -20 degrees Celsius. The combination of extreme cold and inadequate nutrition in bombed-out cities with little heating fuel led to immense suffering. In Berlin alone, over 1,000 deaths were attributed directly to freezing. The calorie deficit limited the productive capacity of the entire workforce, creating a vicious cycle where the energy needed for reconstruction was being consumed by the search for food. For many, the official ration constituted a slow starvation diet, making survival entirely dependent on illicit trade, personal ingenuity, and a relentless daily hustle that defined the period as one of pure subsistence. The task of clearing the unimaginable volume of rubble fell disproportionately to women. Their labor was quickly essential, yet the term Trümmerfrauen, or rubble women, often suggests voluntary civic duty. The reality was more institutional. In many cities, this work became a formal condition for receiving ration cards, a form of compulsory labor service exacted by local authorities, desperate to mobilize any available hands. The Allied occupiers, particularly in the Soviet zone, also implemented mandatory work orders to clear vital transit routes. The work itself was brutally physical and relentless. Women, and sometimes adolescents, formed long human chains across the ruins. They passed bricks and chunks of masonry hand to hand in a systematic effort to sort the debris. The goal was twofold: to clear the streets for basic access and to salvage any reusable building material. Every brick that could be cleaned and stacked represented a small part of a future structure. They worked with the most rudimentary tools, buckets, baskets, and often just their bare hands, prying apart the tangled remains of buildings under consistently dangerous conditions. Unstable piles of wreckage could collapse without warning, and the air was thick with abrasive dust that damaged lungs. This image of women methodically clearing the ruins left by a war started and conducted by men became a powerful symbol for the new Germany. It was a potent visual representation of a fresh start, of a society literally and metaphorically digging itself out from the consequences of its past. The symbolism, however, often served to obscure a much harsher reality. The work was grueling and poorly compensated. In Berlin, for instance, the pay was frequently a slightly improved ration category rather than actual currency. The physical toll was immense, leading to chronic back problems, respiratory issues, and a high risk of injury from broken glass, sharp metal, and falling debris. The practical foundation laid by their labor cannot be overstated. Without clearing the streets, no reconstruction could possibly begin. No trucks could deliver materials, no infrastructure crews could repair water or power lines. The Trümmerfrauen's work was the indispensable first step in rebuilding a functional society from the ground up. Their efforts also signaled a profound social shift. With millions of German men dead, wounded, or still held as prisoners of war, women became the undeniable backbone of the surviving civilian population. They were not only managing households amid extreme scarcity, but were now also performing the most physically demanding civic labor. Why were women called rubble women, and what brutal work did they perform daily? They were the primary labor force for the manual clearing of cities, performing back-breaking work essential for survival, often under coercive conditions. Their efforts represented the first physical step away from the 0 hour, a testament to sheer endurance that began the long process of reclaiming a nation from its own ashes. This collective endeavor, born from dire necessity, slowly transformed the impassable fields of wreckage into nascent construction sites. While German civilians were consumed by the daily struggle for survival, the Allied powers began implementing a comprehensive and systematic plan for the occupied territory. This top-down restructuring occurred in stark parallel to the grassroots fight for food and shelter, often with starkly conflicting priorities. The foundational framework for this occupation was established at the Potsdam Conference in July and August of 1945. The Allies formalized the division of Germany into 4 distinct military zones, each administered by one of the victors: the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. The capital city of Berlin, situated deep within the Soviet zone, was itself partitioned into 4 corresponding sectors, creating an isolated administrative island that would become a focal point for both Allied cooperation and future Cold War conflict. The initial guiding directive for American forces, known as JCS 1067, outlined a harsh and punitive approach. It emphasized Germany's demilitarization and what was termed its pastoralization, a policy explicitly designed to prevent economic recovery and dismantle its industrial capacity for war. This directive made it clear that the German people were not to be treated as allies or friends, reflecting a determination to avoid the perceived mistakes of the post-World War I settlement. The goal was to eliminate any future threat, but this approach also ensured that the humanitarian crisis on the ground would be prolonged and severe. A cornerstone of this policy was the ambitious program of Denazification. Its stated aim was to surgically remove all vestiges of Nazi ideology and membership from public life, purging individuals from government posts, teaching positions, and other roles of influence. The process began with a wave of mass arrests. Hundreds of thousands of former Nazi Party members, along with SS and Gestapo personnel, were swiftly interned in makeshift camps, removing them from positions of authority. To systematically process the rest of the adult population, the Allies instituted a mandatory and exhaustive questionnaire known as the Fragebogen. This document required every German adult to provide a detailed account of their political history and affiliations. The responses were then used to categorize individuals into one of 5 distinct groups: major offenders, lesser offenders, followers, and exonerated persons. This bureaucratic machinery was intended to provide a legal and moral framework for judging complicity, but its implementation was immediately overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the task. The meticulous, case-by-case review of millions of questionnaires proved to be a logistical impossibility, setting the stage for the compromises and shortcuts that would later dilute the process. What happened when the Allied powers divided Germany into 4 occupation zones? They created a fractured political landscape that would harden into the Cold War divide, while simultaneously launching a vast, complex program to purge Nazi ideology. This administrative carve-up established the fundamental structure for all subsequent political and economic development, ensuring that the experience of occupation and the path to recovery would be vastly different depending on one's geographic location. The division was not merely a temporary military arrangement. It was the first concrete step toward the eventual partition of the nation, initiated long before the construction of any physical wall. Another crisis reshaped daily life: the fractured nation, displaced persons, and returning survivors. The German population was not alone in the occupied ruins. Sharing this landscape were more than 10 million Europeans on the move: refugees, displaced persons, deportees, and expellees, one of the largest population movements in modern history. Up to 14 million people required accommodation in the occupied zones, creating an immense logistical burden for authorities still struggling to supply their own cities. Millions of displaced persons, or DPS, lived in camps administered by the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration and, later, the International Refugee Organization. These individuals comprised a diverse group of survivors: those liberated from concentration camps, forced laborers brought from across Nazi-occupied Europe, and former prisoners of war from Eastern nations. The administration of the DP camps often provided shelter, medical care, and rations that were comparatively better than conditions endured by surrounding German communities. This disparity, grounded in a moral imperative to aid primary victims of Nazism, fostered resentment among Germans who were themselves starving and homeless. For Jewish survivors, the nominal end of the war did not end persecution. Many who attempted to return to former towns and cities encountered open hostility and violence from former neighbors. The phrase, "You do not belong here anymore," was a common and chilling refrain, signaling that the ideological foundations of exclusion had not vanished with the regime. The danger was real. On July 4, 1946, the Kielce pogrom in Poland triggered a wave of flight, driving thousands of Polish Jews into the relative safety of German DP camps. As a result, the Jewish population in those camps rose dramatically, from roughly 20,000 in 1945 to about 250,000 by 1947. Evidence of both persistent anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe and the DP system's role as a refuge of last resort. Many Jewish survivors discovered they had no homes to reclaim. Properties had been confiscated, resold, or were occupied by others who refused to vacate. The legal process for restitution was slow and inconsistent. The result was existential limbo, a past obliterated, a European future uncertain, and emigration, especially to Palestine, emerging as the clearest path to safety and self-determination. Within the camps, organized Jewish life rebuilt itself. Schools, newspapers, theaters, and political councils took shape. Medical clinics treated trauma and malnutrition. Aid organizations coordinated transport, documentation, and the paperwork required for immigration. These institutions were fragile but determined. They held a line against despair. The competing claims on scarce resources confronted the Allied administrations with a stark choice: prioritize the victims of Nazism while preventing broader social collapse. Meanwhile, millions of ethnic Germans expelled from Eastern Europe added pressure to housing, food, and transport networks, deepening the strains inside every zone. The presence of DPs was an unblinking reminder of the crimes committed in Germany's name. It challenged the narrative of universal suffering and exposed the gap between immediate humanitarian need and longer-term political strategy. Under that pressure, disagreements among the occupying powers sharpened, and a different contest over economic policy and the future shape of Germany moved to the foreground. By 1946, the facade of Allied unity began to fracture over fundamental disagreements. The central point of contention was economic policy and its ultimate objective for Germany. In the Soviet zone, a systematic process of industrial dismantling was underway. Factories were disassembled and entire railway systems were uprooted to be shipped east as war reparations. This policy was designed to extract maximum value for the Soviet economy while simultaneously crippling Germany's future war-making potential, effectively implementing the pasteurization called for in initial Allied directives. The result was the deliberate deindustrialization of the Eastern Zone, ensuring its long-term economic weakness. The American and British occupation authorities watched this process with growing alarm. Their initial punitive stance, embodied in the harsh directive JCS 1067, was reassessed in light of the escalating humanitarian crisis. The cost of administering a starving, destabilized population was becoming untenable. Furthermore, the strategic calculus was shifting. The emerging confrontation with the Soviet Union, which would soon be formalized as the Cold War, prompted a radical change in approach. The new priority was no longer punishment, but stabilization. A prosperous Western Germany was now seen as a necessary bulwark against the spread of communism. This strategic pivot led to a decisive action. In January 1947, the British and American zones merged economically to form the B-Zone, or Vereinigtes Wirtschaftsgebiet. This was not a political union, but a full economic integration that created a larger, more viable market. It represented a direct challenge to Soviet authority and was a clear, de facto acknowledgement that a unified Germany administered by all four powers was no longer a realistic political goal. The creation of the B-Zone was the crucial administrative step toward the eventual establishment of a West German state. The Soviet response was immediate and predictable. They interpreted the B-Zone as a hostile act designed to permanently split Germany. In retaliation, they accelerated the political and economic Sovietization of their own zone, tightening control and pushing forward with the creation of a centralized socialist state aligned with Moscow. The differing economic philosophies now became starkly institutionalized. In the West, officials like Economic Director Ludwig Erhard began laying the groundwork for a social market economy. In the East, the model was one of state ownership and central planning. In Berlin, the four-power Allied Kommandatura, which was supposed to govern the city jointly, became a forum for constant and increasingly bitter disagreement. Its authority weakened daily as each power pursued its own agenda within its sector. Cooperation eroded into open hostility. The city, a microcosm of the larger occupation, became the central flashpoint for this new conflict. Why did the Western Allies and Soviets begin treating their zones so differently? Fundamental disagreements over economic policy and the emerging Cold War led to a pragmatic separation, with the West prioritizing recovery and the East extraction and Sovietization. This strategic divergence meant that the experience of the Zero Hour would have two very different endings, cementing a division that would last for decades. The economic stagnation was primarily caused by the worthless Reichsmark, as no one wanted to sell goods for a currency that had no value, hindering all trade and activity. This would soon force the West's hand toward even more radical economic intervention. Amid the overwhelming chaos of occupation and survival, the Allies initiated a cautious experiment in political rehabilitation. Recognizing that democracy could not be imposed solely from military headquarters, they licensed political activity at the most local level possible. This was a deliberate strategy to cultivate democratic habits from the ground up, starting with the immediate, tangible needs of individual communities. The British military government, through its specialized administration and local government branch, was particularly systematic. Their officers encouraged and supervised the formation of municipal councils in towns and cities across their zone, providing a framework for Germans to resume a measure of self-governance. These early bodies were not the product of free elections. The Allies, wary of latent Nazi sympathies, initially appointed mayors and council members directly. The selection criteria focused on two attributes: a verifiable anti-Nazi past, often evidenced by time spent in a concentration camp or political imprisonment, and demonstrable technical expertise. An engineer who could get water pumps working was as valuable as a politician who understood civic procedure. The first tasks assigned to these councils were brutally practical, far removed from high politics. Their mandate was to organize rubble clearance, find ways to reopen schools in whatever buildings remained, and coordinate the restoration of basic utilities like water and power. Licensing also followed a careful sequence. Political parties were approved first at the local level, then at regional tiers, and finally at zonal scope. The Christian Democratic Union and the Social Democratic Party began the painstaking work of rebuilding their organizations town by town, district by district, under close Allied scrutiny that vetted leadership and monitored activities. This grassroots, pragmatic approach was a calculated contrast to the centralized tyranny of the Nazi state. It aimed to foster local responsibility and civic engagement, rebuilding trust through visible results that improved daily life. Participation, however, came slowly. The memory of how the Nazi regime had manipulated and corrupted institutions bred skepticism and apathy. The concept of engaging with any political party again felt risky, yet these councils became indispensable. They were the proving ground for a new cohort of administrators and politicians. Specific careers illustrate the pipeline from occupied administration to national leadership. Konrad Adenauer, appointed mayor of Cologne by the Americans before being dismissed, re-entered public life through this framework. Willy Brandt, working with the Norwegian military mission in the immediate post-war period, also navigated this hybrid environment of Allied oversight and German initiative. Their trajectories underscored how early post-war local structures nurtured figures who would later shape national policy. What role did local German initiative play versus top-down Allied directives in Reconstruction? The restoration of basic services was largely driven by these appointed councils working in tandem with and under the supervision of Allied advisors. Germans provided manpower, technical knowledge, and community connections. The Allies supplied authority, security, and resources. This decentralized, collaborative process became a functional embryo of West Germany's federalist structure, showing that the new democracy took root in city halls and community centers where the work of rebuilding began. But administrative revival did not fill empty stomachs. Even as councils reopened schools and mapped water lines, daily survival demanded other methods that did not wait for official approval. The official systems of rationing and currency were entirely insufficient for survival. This total failure of the formal economy gave rise to a pervasive culture of improvisation and ingenuity, a phenomenon later termed the Zusammenbruchgesellschaft, the collapsed society. Within this parallel economic reality, the black market operated not as a fringe activity, but as a central and indispensable pillar of daily life. Its preferred currency was not the worthless Reichsmark, but the cigarette. The value of this commodity was not set by any German authority, but by the PX stores of the Allied armies, making it a stable and universally accepted medium of exchange for everything from bread to building materials. Barter became the foundational mechanism of commerce. The transaction was simple and direct. A family heirloom, a piece of jewelry, or a fine rug might be traded for a sack of coal or a bushel of potatoes. A complete porcelain dinner service could secure a pair of sturdy shoes. This system required no banks and acknowledged no official prices, only the immediate, desperate need of two parties. The morality of acquisition was similarly reframed by necessity. The term Fringsen entered the vernacular, derived from a controversial 1946 New Year's Eve sermon by Cologne's Cardinal Joseph Frings. While not explicitly endorsing theft, his suggestion that taking essentials like fuel or food to survive could be justified by divine law provided a powerful moral rationale for countless acts of petty pilferage from Allied supply trains and coal depots. This ethos of repurposing extended to every facet of material life. Nothing was considered waste. Parachute silk retrieved from downed aircraft was unraveled and sewn into blouses and dresses. Sturdy wooden ammunition boxes were dismantled and reconstructed into tables and shelves. The very rubble being cleared by the Trümmerfrauen was meticulously sorted, with intact bricks cleaned and stacked for reuse in new construction. Every object was evaluated not for its original purpose, but for its potential utility in the present crisis. Navigating this informal economy required constant vigilance and relied heavily on dense social networks. Knowing who had something to trade, who needed a specific item, or who possessed information about an upcoming Allied shipment was a valuable form of social capital. Trust was a fragile commodity, and exchanges were often conducted with a wary efficiency. The line between survival strategy and outright criminality was profoundly blurred. Actions that in any stable society would be unequivocally condemned as theft were reclassified as necessary, even justified, strategies for enduring another day. This period of relentless hustle fostered a deep-seated pragmatism and a lasting distrust of official pronouncements that would characterize the post-war German mentality for generations. The experience of relying entirely on one's own ingenuity and social connections, while the state's currency and ration systems failed, created a population that valued self-reliance and viewed authority with skepticism. How did ordinary Germans adapt their daily survival strategies during acute shortages? They created a vast informal economy based on barter, theft, and repurposing, where ingenuity and social connections were more valuable than Reichsmarks. Life became a continuous series of calculated transactions, a stark contrast to the ordered, controlled society that had been promised and then obliterated by the former regime. Every interaction was a negotiation, every possession a potential tool for barter, in a world where the official economy had ceased to function. As Denazification moved beyond initial mass arrests, the sheer logistical scale of the undertaking became paralyzing. The Allies were quickly overwhelmed by the millions of Fragebogen questionnaires that demanded individual review. Faced with this administrative impossibility, the occupiers began transferring the entire process to German-run tribunals, known as Spruchkammern, or Denazification Court, starting in 1946. This handover, intended to foster German responsibility, instead opened the door to widespread circumvention of the process. The system became immediately vulnerable to local networks of favor and influence. A cynical term entered common parlance, the Persilschein. Named after a popular brand of laundry detergent known for making clothes whiter than white, these were sworn affidavits provided by colleagues, friends, or clergy that effectively whitewashed an individual's Nazi past. A local baker or shopkeeper might testify that a former minor party official had acted with decency, quietly helping others, or expressing private doubts about the regime. These certificates became a currency of acquittal, allowing many with significant involvement to be reclassified as mere followers or even exonerated. The legalistic process, bogged down in this morass of paperwork and testimony, often punished low-level functionaries while many more prominent figures managed to evade meaningful scrutiny. A profound practical problem accelerated this dilution of justice. To physically rebuild a destroyed country and administer a functioning society, the Allies and the new German authorities needed expertise. They required engineers to repair bridges, doctors to staff hospitals, teachers to educate children, and experienced civil servants to manage municipal governments. The unfortunate reality was that a significant portion of this professional class had been members of the Nazi Party, often as a simple condition of career advancement. A tacit and deeply pragmatic bargain was struck. The urgent need for competent administration began to outweigh the ideal of political purity. This led to the rapid reintegration of countless former Nazis into positions essential for recovery. Public perception of denazification grew increasingly resentful. To many Germans, already struggling with the hardships of occupation, the process seemed like a hypocritical form of victor's justice. This sentiment intensified as the Cold War crystallized. The emerging confrontation with the Soviet Union rapidly transformed the geopolitical calculus. Former Nazi officials with useful skills, particularly those with intelligence on the Eastern Bloc, were increasingly viewed not as enemies to be punished, but as potential assets to be utilized. The grand Allied ambition of a thorough moral and political cleansing gradually gave way to the pragmatic demands of building a stable Western Allied state and countering the Soviet threat. How did denazification policies affect hundreds of thousands of German civilians? They created a chaotic and often resented bureaucratic process that initially caused significant professional and social disruption, but was gradually watered down due to overwhelming practicality and dramatically shifting Allied priorities. The initial goal of a comprehensive reckoning was largely abandoned, leaving a shallow and incomplete judicial process in its place. This failure to confront the full extent of complicity created a silent, unresolved burden, a collective avoidance of difficult truths that subsequent generations of Germans would be forced to address long after the occupiers had departed. The courts became a mechanism for reintegration rather than punishment, setting a precedent that expertise could absolve past political sins. Alongside the physical reconstruction and political reorganization, the Allies confronted a more subtle challenge: what to do with the physical remnants of the Nazi state. The landscape was littered with the architectural symbols of a defeated ideology, each structure presenting a dilemma of memory and purpose. The solution was not uniform, but a calculated curation of the visible environment, an early and potent form of memory politics designed to shape how future generations would understand the recent past. Some sites, due to their immense scale, defied simple demolition. The Nazi Party rally grounds in Nuremberg, with their colossal, unfinished Congress Hall, were left standing as stark, deliberate monuments to the regime's grotesque ambitions and ultimate failure. Their sheer bulk made removal impractical, but their preserved ruinous state served as a perpetual, silent indictment. Other locations demanded a more surgical approach. The complex of buildings on Prince Albrechtstrasse in Berlin, which had housed the Gestapo and SS headquarters, was largely razed. However, the cellars where prisoners had been interrogated and tortured were deliberately preserved within the resulting empty lot. This decision to keep the foundations exposed transformed the site into a raw, open wound in the cityscape, which would decades later become the formal topography of Terror Documentation Center. The message was clear. The superstructure of power could be torn down, but the foundation of its brutality must remain visible. A systematic campaign of symbolic erasure occurred simultaneously. Work crews, often under Allied supervision, carefully chiseled swastikas and other Nazi insignia from public buildings, monuments, and even manhole covers. Statues of Hitler and other party leaders were torn from their pedestals and melted down for scrap metal. The visual language of the Third Reich was to be scrubbed from daily view. The Allies also employed documentary evidence to solidify this narrative of defeat. Photographers and film crews were dispatched to capture the ruined state of key Nazi sites. such as the burned-out Reich Chancellery. These images, disseminated widely, created an official visual record of the regime's downfall, reinforcing the totality of its military and moral collapse. This editing of the physical landscape reflected a deep tension between competing impulses: the desire to punish by erasure, the need to educate through preserved evidence, and the overwhelming practical demands of reconstruction. This conflict was perhaps most vividly illustrated in the debates over historical landmarks untouched by Nazi ideology, such as Germany's many bombed-out churches. Heated discussions ensued over whether to rebuild them exactly as they were, creating a sense of historical continuity, or to embrace modern architectural styles as a deliberate break with all pasts, including the recent one. The new construction that began to rise from the rubble was therefore not just about providing shelter. It was a conscious statement about identity. Modernist architecture, with its clean lines and rejection of historical ornamentation, was seen by many as the appropriate aesthetic for a new, democratic Germany. What happened to Nazi symbols and buildings in the occupied territories? They were systematically removed, destroyed, or repurposed in a conscious effort to erase the visual language of Nazism and create a new physical environment. The landscape itself was being edited, a silent but powerful form of re-education that worked in tandem with the more overt programs of denazification. Every decision about what to destroy, what to leave as a ruin, and what to build anew was a deliberate step in dismantling the physical psyche of the Third Reich. This process ensured that the cities rising from the ashes would not merely replicate the past, but would embody a conscious, if contested, reinterpretation of national memory, where the traces of the former regime were either absent or framed explicitly as cautionary artifacts. The fundamental cause of the economic stagnation between 1945 and 1948 was the complete collapse of the Reichsmark. The currency had become utterly worthless because no one had any faith in its value. Farmers refused to sell their produce for paper that could not buy anything in return. Factory owners saw little point in manufacturing goods when the payments they received were meaningless. The entire economy had reverted to a primitive system of barter and black market trading because the official medium of exchange was dysfunctional. This paralysis ensured that the period of pure subsistence would continue indefinitely, trapping the population in a cycle where the means for recovery were perpetually out of reach. This deadlock was broken by a single, decisive act. On June 20th, 1948, in the 3 Western occupation zones, the old Reichsmarks were declared invalid. In their place, a new currency was introduced, the Deutsche Mark. The exchange was strictly controlled. Initially, every individual received 40 new DMs. A second exchange occurred later, but at a steep discount, effectively wiping out large hoarded sums of old currency. This was a calculated move to destroy the monetary overhang that was crippling the economy. The effect was not gradual, it was instantaneous. Within a day, goods that had been hidden away for years suddenly appeared in shop windows. Farmers brought their produce to market, confident they could now receive meaningful payment. The black market, which had been an essential pillar of the survival economy, lost its fundamental purpose almost overnight. The currency reform was the critical catalyst, but it was coupled with another crucial policy shift. Economic Director Ludwig Erhard, defying Allied orders, simultaneously abolished price controls. This dual action unleashed the latent productive capacity of the West German economy. The combination of a stable, trusted currency and the freedom for prices to find their natural level provided the incentive for businesses to produce and invest. The era of the Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle, had begun. This marked the true end of the zero hour for the West. The period defined by scavenging and sheer survival was over, replaced by the dynamics of growth and reconstruction. The reform was a bold, top-down intervention that created the conditions for bottom-up entrepreneurial energy to flourish. It was also a profoundly political and divisive act. The Soviets condemned it as a deliberate wrecking tactic designed to permanently split Germany. They saw the creation of a separate economic sphere in the West as a direct threat to their own influence and to the principle of four-power control. The reform created two distinct economic worlds, a revitalizing West embracing a social market economy, and an East still struggling under a Soviet-style command economy and the continued burden of reparations. The role of the Marshall Plan in this recovery is often misunderstood. While its direct financial contribution was significant, its psychological impact and the political framework it provided were arguably more important. The currency reform it helped enable was the true engine of change. The Marshall Plan funds provided crucial investment capital for rebuilding industry, but the reform created the stable economic environment in which that investment could be effective. It was the Deutsche Mark that gave the population the confidence to participate in a formal economy again. June 20th, 1948, therefore, represents the definitive schism. It was the day the Western Allies chose economic recovery and integration with the West over the increasingly futile pursuit of a unified Germany. The Soviet response was not long in coming, setting the stage for a direct confrontation over the city that symbolized the entire conflict. The creation of a viable currency in the West solidified the economic division that would soon be mirrored by a permanent political partition. The journey from the rubble of 1945 had reached a point of no return, with two Germanys now on irrevocably separate paths. The Soviet response to the Western currency reform was swift and absolute. Just 4 days after the Deutsche Mark was introduced, on June 24, 1948, Soviet forces cut all land and water routes to the western sectors of Berlin. Railways were blocked, highway access was barred, and barges were halted on the rivers and canals. The goal of this blockade was to starve the Western Allies out of the city, creating a crisis of such magnitude that they would be forced to abandon their plans for a separate West German state. It was a strategy of siege, leveraging the city's geographic isolation deep within the Soviet zone to force a political capitulation. The Western answer was not retreat, but an unprecedented logistical operation. The Allies, primarily the United States and Great Britain, initiated the Berlin airlift. This was not a temporary measure, but a full-scale supply operation intended to sustain a city of over 2 million people entirely by air. The challenge was immense. The initial requirement was estimated at a minimum of 4,500 tons of supplies per day, including food, coal for heating and power, and essential machinery. To meet this demand, cargo planes, mainly American C-47s and C-54s and British Dakotas and Yorks, landed at Tempelhof and Tegel airports in West Berlin around the clock. At the operation's peak, a plane was landing every 90 seconds, creating a constant, thrumming procession in the skies over the city. The airlift became a powerful demonstration of Western technological prowess and resolve. It stood in stark contrast to the Soviet strategy of starvation. The precision required was extraordinary. Pilots followed meticulously planned flight paths, and ground crews in Berlin worked with relentless efficiency to unload and turn around aircraft in minutes. The operation expanded to include the construction of a third airport, Tegel, built in just 90 days by Berliners using rubble from the destroyed city. The airlift also transformed the psychological relationship between the West Berliners and their occupiers. The American and British flyers were no longer seen as conquerors, but as protectors. This shift was cemented by gestures like the Raisin Bombers, pilots who dropped small parachutes with candy for the city's children. The Soviet blockade failed. After 322 days, having achieved none of their political objectives, the Soviets conceded defeat and reopened the land corridors on May 12, 1949. The airlift, however, continued until September to build a sufficient reserve, having delivered over 2.3 million tons of supplies. The blockade and the successful airlift permanently altered the political landscape. It made the division of Germany a concrete reality and demonstrated that the Western powers were committed to defending their zones at any cost. The Allied decision to preserve certain Nazi-era buildings finds a clear rationale in this event. Tempelhof Airport, a monumental structure built by the Nazi regime, was transformed through the airlift into a symbol of freedom and democratic resilience. Its preservation was justified not for its origins, but for its new identity as a lifeline. The 11-month confrontation ended any remaining pretense of four-power cooperation. The city of Berlin was now definitively the front line of the Cold War, a status that would define it for the next 4 decades. The shared administration of Germany was dead, replaced by a hardened frontier running directly through the heart of a nation and a city. The political and economic rupture of the Berlin blockade and airlift rendered the creation of separate German states an irreversible fact. The Federal Republic of Germany was formally established in the Western zones on May 23, 1949. Its provisional capital was set in the small, seemingly insignificant Rhineland city of Bonn, a deliberate choice to avoid the symbolic weight and ruined grandeur of Berlin. The new state's constitutional framework, known as the Basic Law, was crafted as a direct and explicit rebuke to the centralized tyranny of the Nazi state. Its core principles emphasized federalism, democracy, and the inviolability of human rights. This document was not merely a set of rules. It was an institutional safeguard against the past. The Soviet response followed predictably. On October 7, 1949, the German Democratic Republic was proclaimed in the Soviet zone. Its creation was a reactive measure, a top-down imposition mirroring the political structure of its sponsor. The 0 hour thus reached two starkly divergent conclusions. In the West, the journey from the rubble culminated in a parliamentary democracy firmly aligned with the Western powers and now positioned for its economic miracle. In the East, it culminated in a single-party socialist state, fully integrated into the Soviet bloc and governed by the principles of central planning and state control. The contrast could not have been more profound. The foundations for these two states had been laid in the preceding 4 years of occupation. The Western approach, which had cautiously encouraged grassroots political development through the appointment of local councils, provided a ready-made framework for the Federal Republic. The men and women who had managed municipal utilities, organized rubble clearance, and reopened schools formed the nucleus of a new political and administrative class. Their experience in pragmatic, localized problem-solving under Allied supervision directly informed the federalist structure of the new West German state. The path in the East was one of uncompromising top-down imposition, where political structures were designed in Moscow and implemented by the Socialist Unity Party. The collective experience of the immediate post-war years, the pervasive hunger, the back-breaking labor of clearing debris, the constant improvisation of the black market profoundly shaped the political culture of the nascent Federal Republic. It bred a deep-seated pragmatism, a suspicion of grand ideological promises, and a valorization of economic stability above all else. This mentality, forged in the struggle for mere subsistence, would define the West German electorate for decades. How did German communities organize makeshift schools and hospitals without government support? This grassroots ingenuity, demonstrated in the immediate aftermath, evolved into the localized federalist principle that became a cornerstone of the West German state, proving the lasting impact of this bottom-up revival. The community efforts to teach children in bombed-out buildings and tend to the sick in repurposed basements were the precursors to a system that valued local autonomy and civic responsibility. The journey from the rubble of 1945 had reached its destination in two capital cities, Bonn and East Berlin. It was a destination few could have predicted at the start, one that exchanged the dream of a unified nation for the hard reality of two Germanys, each a reflection of the superpower that had midwifed its birth. The physical and psychological landscape of defeat had been reshaped into a new, permanent division, cementing the Cold War frontier in the heart of Europe for the next 40 years. The story of Germany's Zero Hour is not one of passive victimhood or simple Allied rescue. It is a story of collapse and a fragmented, often desperate, but ultimately decisive regeneration from below. The physical and moral rubble of the Nazi regime was cleared not just by policies, but by the daily, grinding labor of ordinary people. The economic recovery was ignited by a currency reform, but it was powered by a populace that had learned to survive through immense hardship. If this story of resilience changed your understanding, subscribe to Epic War for more deep dives. Share your thoughts below. If this story moved you, challenged you, or helped you see the Second World War differently, it would be an honor to have you join our growing community. Subscribing isn't just a click. It's a way to support more powerful stories, more forgotten voices, and more truth from the past. So if you believe these stories matter, hit that subscribe button and let's keep building this journey together. And don't forget to leave a comment. We read everyone and love hearing your thoughts. Until next time, keep exploring history with Epic War. Keep asking questions. Keep seeking the truth.